Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's GTCS Wellbeing Wednesday webinar, Ask the Health and Wellbeing Specialists. I'm Fraser Shand and I work at GTCS as Digital Communications and Events Coordinator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join us over the phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can also use this pane to toggle between your device speakers and headphones should you have any difficulty with hearing the presentation. You can submit questions by typing these into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions, thoughts and reflections at any time during the presentation. All those who raise questions will be entered into a prize draw tonight to win a copy of Dr. Emma Hepburn's book, A Toolkit for Modern Life, 53 Ways to Look After Your Mind. We'll perform a random prize draw tomorrow and inform the winner by email. You can also use the questions pane to raise any technical issues you have, and we will do the best we can to find a solution. Please note that the GoToWebinar system is hosted online and relies on our home internet connections, so please bear with us should we encounter any difficulties during the webinar tonight. I would now like to introduce Sharon Smith to introduce tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Fraser, and welcome everyone to our second Wellbeing Wednesday. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name's Sharon Smith, and I've been working alongside today's panellists to support teacher wellbeing during these recent challenging times. I just want to thank you all very much for joining us today. We really do appreciate the efforts you make to do so, and very much welcome all the questions that have been sent to us in advance of today's session. We've pulled these together into themes and we'll post the questions in your chat pane so that you can read them rather than having me read them to you. If you should have any further live questions, please add them to the question pane, as Fraser said, and we can come to these throughout this afternoon's hour and a half. Before I hand you over to the panellists to introduce themselves, please make sure that you've settled in, you've got a cuppa, you've got a pen and paper ready to take any notes, and you're comfortable and ready to go. Unfortunately, one of the panellists today, Paul Smith, has had to pull out last minute due to illness, so I just want to wish Paul a speedy recovery. I now have the great pleasure to welcome our remaining panellists today, Emma, Claire and Sarah. So Emma, if I could ask you to start off by introducing yourself.
Sure. I'm Dr. Emma Hepburn and I'm a clinical psychologist and author of the prize giveaway, A Toolkit for Modern Life, which is all about looking after your mind and well-being proactively and also thinking about how we can manage that reactively as well. I work in the NHS predominantly, but also write wellbeing courses at Aberdeen University.
Thank you. Claire?
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you very much to Emma as well and Sarah. So my name is Claire Lavelle. I am the Managing Director of the Hive of Wellbeing, which sounds very grand. I am the Hive, it's just me. And in the work that I do, my background is education. My background is that I was a former head teacher in East Lothian, and I was also a head teacher out in the Middle East. I'm now a coach, and I'm working with educators throughout Scotland to support them with their wellbeing during these really challenging times.
Thank you, Claire. And Sarah?
Thank you. I'm Sarah. I am a coach. I'm also a psychologist and just an educator, to be honest. And I've worked across a few different local authorities in Scotland and more nationally over the last kind of few years. And I would also say tonight that I am a yoga teacher, and the reason for making that point will become evident as we go through some of the questions tonight. So thanks.
Looking forward to it. Okay, so thanks very much for introducing yourselves, and you're very welcome to be here. We're looking forward to hearing about your thoughts and opinions towards people's questions. So Fraser will post the next couple of questions into the chat panel for you. So what we've decided to do is to pull these into themes, and the theme of this coming up is asking for help, recognising and owning how we feel. So I'd like to bring these questions firstly to Sarah, and then maybe Claire, you could step in as well and help.
Yeah, I think sometimes when it comes to asking for help, it can really feel like quite a difficult thing to do, and it can feel like you're the only one. And it's important to know somewhere in you to know and to recognise that actually you're never the only one. And sometimes that that feeling of thinking it's only me that feels this way, or it's only me that needs help, can really hold us captive and kind of hooks us in a place where we then avoid talking about how we're feeling, we avoid asking for help, we avoid sharing that with others. But if we are going to manage our emotions really well, in a way that enables us to thrive and to live and to enjoy the life and work that we're engaged in, then we need to go beyond that kind of inner part of emotion and how we're feeling. So recognizing that we're feeling something, understanding what it is, being able to label it, put words to it, that's a very internal kind of process. But to really move through that whole kind of process of managing our emotions, we need to also be able to share that feeling with someone else. We need to express it, and we need someone to hear that, and we need someone to listen to that as well. And that then enables us to activate some of our regulation strategies. So sometimes when we're feeling particular ways, we actually want to enhance the way we're feeling. We want to feel more of it. We often think managing our emotions is about moving away from or reducing certain feelings, but it's important to recognize it's also about enhancing and getting more of that thing. But also it is about sometimes shifting into a different state and a different emotion. So that process of being able to say how you're feeling, being able to ask for help is really, really important. But what often holds us back is worrying about, will we be heard? Will we be judged? Will we be accepted for what we say and how we feel? And what will others think of us? So often those kind of things can get in the way of us expressing those emotions and expressing how we're feeling. But what's interesting is that quite often simply just saying it out loud reduces a lot of the kind of emotional charge that the way we're feeling has and the hold that it has over us. So sometimes, you know yourself, you've probably said it yourself many times, I feel better even just saying that out loud to you. And the other person sometimes doesn't need to do anything, and sometimes you don't do anything, but the very fact that you've said it out loud suddenly just changes the kind of power and control and the charge that it has over you. But with that vulnerability of saying it out loud, we need to trust in the person who's hearing us. So you know, thinking about, you know, how can we create trusting relationships and trusting cultures within our workplaces that mean that there's less vulnerability in saying how you feel, because we know that that trust is there. We know we're going to be listened to. We know we're going to be heard. And sometimes we create rules for ourselves about what we will share at home and what we will share in work. And sometimes those rules, you know, are just created by ourselves, often as a way to try and keep ourselves safe, to kind of protect ourselves from that vulnerability. But sometimes, you know, because they are made up rules, they actually don't need to exist. And sometimes we need to think carefully about what's getting in the way of me sharing how I'm feeling, what's getting in the way of me asking for help, and is it something real, or is it something I've kind of created for myself? And could I change that? Could I shift that? I think sometimes if saying how you feel is really difficult, journaling can be a great tool to kind of get out of your own head. Sometimes get stuck in our own head. Sometimes that's the worst place to be. So, you know, that process of just journaling and writing down, putting the words that are in your head on paper, can be a really useful exercise to become more aware of what's going on, to manage it. And sometimes that's a release as well. It's another form of expression. And sometimes, and I know Claire's going to talk about this idea of burden and what is a burden and who are we to be a burden. But connected to that is that idea of balance. You know, it's about giving and receiving. And if we only ever give, it means we're not in that place of receiving. But actually, to receive allows someone else to give. And sometimes we can again create this idea that to receive is some kind of weakness, or there's a hierarchy there between giving and receiving, and actually they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And if you are open to receiving, then it enables others to give, but also it models that process of being able to receive as well. So Claire, do you want to pick up there?
I think you've said everything, Sarah. Let's move on. No, I'm just kidding. That's wonderful. And thank you so much. Yeah, certainly. I think picking up on the second part of the question that was asked about the burden, and as you'd mentioned as well, the idea of the burden and being a pain, again, tying in with what you said so articulately there about our perceptions of who we think we are and what we are having to process at this particular time. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to reframe that idea of burden and instead give ourselves permission to be sharing. And therefore, in sharing with one another, we find different ways then to connect. And it ties in nicely with your idea there of, giving and receiving and how receptive people are. Certainly from looking at some of the work I've looked at and some of the experiences I've had, even in this lockdown time and in the recovery time, although people are frustrated that they physically can't come together in the staff rooms, or they can't come together in the gym halls, or not even socially distanced safely at this time, even online you can create that kind of sense of connectedness where you can share, and it's not about the being a burden, it's the sharing of everyone's burden, that we're in it together. And certainly when I've been working with some people just now on sessions that they've been signed up to by managers at this particular time, they might have been saying to managers, I've really not got time for this, but actually it's just what was needed. It's just what was needed at this particular time to give them that sense of reassurance, that sense of we are in it together. There's that empathy, because the fact is there's never going to be time, and yet there is always time, and it's dependent on our choice about what we choose to do. Regarding that kind of connectedness, even online, when we share our challenges at this particular time, but when we connect, I'm very aware that kind of social bonding hormone of oxytocin is very real for us and very soothing. And at a time when we physically can't be with each other, there is still that sense of connection at an emotional level, at a cognitive level, and at a motivational level to make things better. Recently, as well, I was speaking to a head teacher who was saying to me, sometimes, when I'm working and I feel that I've got to fix things, I feel like I've got to try and fix things. Sometimes I feel that, I'm living in a dustbin trying to keep clean because people's things are sticking to me. And it's really challenging when we also feel that perhaps we don't want to burden everyone with the things that have stuck to us. I think it's good to consider it's not necessarily about, in these circumstances when we share with each other, it's not necessarily about you having to carry other people's stuff. It's actually about you trying to see it with empathy through their eyes, feel it through what they're feeling, and just not carrying it away necessarily, and also not falling into that role of rescuing. And we don't need to go to that place of rescuing or fixing. We need to be very conscious in our choices about being together, being present to each other, but we don't have to carry each other's dustbin rubbish at this time. We just need to be aware of it and to reassure one another at this time.
Great answers, Lady. Thanks very much. I particularly like the sentiment of giving and receiving. That's such a lovely thing. And actually, when you think about it, that's exactly what we do when we ask somebody to listen. We're giving, but they're receiving as well. And the fact being together, clear, and being present is so important. And actually, people feel really valued, I think, when somebody honours you. If somebody asks to talk to me about something, I feel very privileged that they've, so I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. We're not necessarily burdening, but people will feel the value that you bring to them with that. So thank you very much. Okay, moving on then. The next questions that Fraser will post for you are in the theme of around techniques to support anxiety for teachers and pupils. Now, unfortunately, Paul would have spoken a little about the work he's done at Blairn High School to support pupils with anxiety. But I'd like to come to Claire, perhaps if you would maybe start, and then Emma, or Emma, would you like to start first?
I'm happy to start. I just wanted to say I really enjoyed listening. Yeah, brilliant. I really enjoyed listening to your answers there and absolutely agree with what you said about that, Claire and Sarah. I think what's really important when it comes to emotions, I'm regressing a bit here, sorry to just respond to their question, is that if we suppress our own emotions, it actually creates more physiological stress in our body. So that sharing is really helpful, but also sharing is actually probably more helpful for the person who's helping rather than the person that's sharing, because it's beneficial for people to help people. So when you're sharing something with somebody, you're actually getting some benefit for them as well. So just to add that in. But now we'll come to the question. So yeah, the question is around about mindfulness and managing your own stress. And there was a specific question about mindfulness. And there's so much evidence that mindfulness, it doesn't have to be mindfulness, awareness of the presence. So I'm going to shift it from mindfulness to awareness of the presence is hugely beneficial for your well-being. The evidence for that is quite overwhelming. So often our brain is future orientated. We're caught up in thinking what will happen. That makes sense because our brains are designed to plan and organize and anticipate and fill the uncertainties of the future. So sometimes that could be helpful. And sometimes we ruminate on the past. That also makes sense. We need to think about the past to get memories into our mind. Sometimes that can become unhelpful if we're catastrophizing when we look to the future, or if we're ruminating over things that can't be fixed or worrying about things. So bringing our mind to the present and being aware of what goes on in the here and now has been shown to be hugely beneficial for our brains. There's some really interesting research on how it actually impacts on your brain in terms of increasing cell generation in the hippocampus, which is associated with memory, but also reducing certain activity in the amygdala, which is associated with kind of your brain reacting to threat. So very early stages, but it's showing there are changes in the brain with mindfulness. So there's really helpful apps with mindfulness. There's Headspace, there's Calm, there's many apps now, and some are actually free for healthcare workers or education workers at the moment. So it's worth looking into that during COVID. But you actually don't have to fully do meditation or mindfulness to get the benefits. You can do it no matter what you're doing. So if you go for a walk or whatever you enjoy doing, if you enjoy cooking, if you enjoy crafting, whatever it is, you can bring your attention to the here and now. And that's also as beneficial. So for example, going for a walk, you can think about what is in the environment right now. What do you notice? At the moment it's autumn trees. Look at all the colours in autumn trees. You can notice the sounds, so leaves crunching beneath your feet, or you can notice birds and they, so I'm going to say speaking, whatever birds do, tweeting. You can notice the smells of autumn. So it's bringing your mind to the sensory information in the here and now. And you can do that whether you're cooking, eating, lots of information on mindful eating out there, going for walks, just sit in a room. You can think about 5 things you can see, 4 things you can, there's a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique where you can just bring in your mind to the sensory information in the room. That's a really nice thing to do. And what that does is when we're stressed, our sympathetic nervous system gets us ready for action. When we bring our focus to our awareness, another nice way of doing that is through breathing, just being aware of our breath. It instead activates our parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest nervous system, and that helps us calm down. So I say mindful breathing is another thing you can do, just bring your awareness to the breath, and I imagine Sarah's probably better at speaking about that than me. But it doesn't have to be mindfulness per se, it's whatever activates your parasympathetic nervous system. And I think about it in terms of anxiety roundabout. You're going through that anxiety roundabout, your parasympathetic or your sympathetic nervous system is winding up, is getting a stronger and stronger effect. And it's helpful to think when you're feeling like that, what are your routes off that roundabout? What helps engage instead your parasympathetic nervous system that gets you off that roundabout? And it's probably different for all of us in this room or this virtual room. It's different for everybody because everybody, whatever relaxes everybody is different. I do like getting up and moving. That relaxes me. Some people hate that. For some people, it's sitting down and watching TV. So it depends. There's not a one-size-fits-all technique, but it's helpful to have a range of techniques. If you think about the sympathetic nervous system cranking up, what are your routes off that, and having helpful routes off that so you can feel in control when that starts to happen. So I'm going to pass over to see if anybody else wants to add anything to that.
Sure. No, thank you so much, Emma. So comprehensive. Thank you very much. I'm just going to pitch in here, but I'm just looking at that bit about supporting the pupils in health and wellbeing, and I just thought about, I suppose I just wanted to share a technique that I have found very helpful in my own life. And it's a technique where, and I think it's been quite useful. I've actually spoken to some parents about the use of this with their own children. And it's this whole idea of externalizing the anxiety. So I know it's used in the narrative therapy approach, whereby you don't identify as an anxious person, but you identify that the anxious thoughts have arrived, or that the worry thoughts have arrived. And a really nice activity, I think, to do with young people is to get them to think of a metaphor, to get them to think of an image or some way to personify that particular emotion. So I often talk about Henrietta, and please forgive me if any of you have a relation called Henrietta who's a beloved person to you. Well, Henrietta's become very beloved to me because Henrietta is the personification of my anxiety at times. Henrietta at 5 to 4 was knocking my door down, and Henrietta takes the form of this lovely lady, but she's very, very strict, and she always comes with a clipboard of all the things that I haven't done of a day, and they are plentiful, let me tell you. But I find that has been a useful technique for me to use in my life, just to find a way of externalizing this and having a relationship almost with those thoughts and emotions that are visiting me at that particular time. And sometimes that has, and I've witnessed this in some sessions with people where they've gone, actually, that just is much more easy to grapple with than just putting it down to I'm a born worrier. Because often we do have default patterns and places which we have habituated to. But knowing that there are strategies to overcome some of that, and some of it takes a lot of practice, then that can be really, really helpful. I also just wanted to pick up as well and just to echo what Emma was saying there about, mindfulness does not have to be complex. It does not have to be a big deal. And it can be just as simple as Emma was saying about, just taking some deep breaths. I'm speaking to some practitioners recently who were telling me they're having to find their deep breathing techniques anywhere they can in the school building that's safe just now. So just finding a quiet time to do some deep breaths. And also just echoing this idea of, mindful eating, mindful walking, just slowing things down and being present. And lastly, I'll just add in, and just what Emma was saying there about the rest and digest response, this idea of self-soothing, this idea of we need to find ways to soothe ourselves at a time when we perhaps can't physically connect, we can't go for the hugs that we would normally have. And therefore using the approach of self-compassion, just using those questions of what would my best friend say to me about this situation, which I'm finding challenging just now, have other people experienced this before, and just labelling, again, externalising those thoughts and feelings at this particular time. Yeah, those are my thoughts about some of that. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
I was just going to show you some of my versions of externalising emotions. There we go. That's my ones from the book where the emotions are externalised, drawn them out. And I think that is coming to the point about children. We assume that understanding our emotions is intrinsic. It is absolutely not intrinsic. It is something we learn, and we learn through understanding how, or watching how other people learn or deal with their emotions, and learning to label our emotions. So it's very much a language construct. So absolutely, I think that's fantastic, externalizing and taking it away from yourself, but also understanding what emotions actually are. There's still a stigma around emotions that we should be shameful for experiencing emotions. That to me is quite bizarre, because our brain, the whole point of our brain, part of it is to have emotions. We need them. So normalizing emotions, allowing children to think experience emotions is okay, and helping them. There's a term called emotional granulation. We know that the more people are able to label and finely grain their emotions, and externalizing, like Claire said, is really helpful for that, the better they are at managing their emotions. And that's also managing, like I thought a really good point Sarah said earlier on, managing increasing positive emotions, or what we sometimes label as positive emotions, and also managing when they feel bad. So helping children understand, label, and normalize their emotions are absolutely key. And if children feel more in control and feel they can cope with their emotions, feel they can do something about it, and know what's going on, then we know their well-being's higher. So yeah, really good points there, Claire. Thank you.
No, thank you. May I just chip in just with something else? I think it's really fantastic. I'm also just aware, it's just occurred to me as we're chatting just now, that you know, we're doing a lot for our children, and we're supporting our children to develop these techniques. And as educators, as adults working in the field that we're working in education, it's not necessarily the case that we ever cultivated those practices or habits of self-care. And it's a bit of a new field for us all. And is it any wonder that as educators working in our schools and our early year settings just now, we are finding this really challenging? Because as you say, Emma, there has been throughout time quite a stigma, as you say, around experiencing those emotions. So even, it just strikes me, even in the last number of weeks, quite a few people have said to me, you know, I'm really sorry, but I've been feeling really angry. What are you sorry for? You're allowed to say that you're feeling angry, or you're allowed to say that you feel resentment, because by naming it, you tame it. Oh, geez. But it is just, you know, it is just allowing that permission to say it as you feel it, and then we can move it on, you know. So thanks for that. Figured me, that's good.
Wow, great discussion there, ladies. Thanks very much. I think, Claire, we spoke in a previous webinar. I think we had a question about great ideas, but how on earth do I manage these and where do I find the time to do it? But actually, we came up with the idea that, well, let's do it with the children. Let's do it as part of our learning, and then we're all learning together and all feeling the benefits of dealing with any, you know, all issues around about our health and well-being and our feelings. So yeah, win-win for everyone.
Can I just chip in there as well around, you know, Emma mentions breathing, but there's something that we do every single moment of every day, and actually is a hugely underrated tool or part of our toolkit when it comes to our well-being. And actually it's something that for the majority of us, we tend to breathe quite shallowly, and we tend to breathe just in the chest, in the upper part of our lungs, and that is aggravating our nervous system all the time. So actually, if we can cultivate that slower, deeper breathing, we don't need extra time to do it, because we're already doing it every single moment of every day. And there's a great book that came out just recently by, I think, James Nestor or Nesta or something, called Breath. And there's so, have you got it, Emma?
Yeah, I've got it, yeah.
You're reaching.
There's so many great tools in that, and so many great practices just to help you become aware of and think about how you use your breath. We take something like 25,000 breaths a day. So actually, if we just looked at how we could improve the quality of those, we would be having a massive impact on our well-being without much effort.
I was reaching to try and get it there, but it's slightly out of my reach, so I'm not going to. But I think Claire's such a good point. You know, we think breathing is so simple, but actually once there's a whole book, it's about that thick on breathing, and you think, how can somebody write that much about breathing? But once you get into it, you think, actually, it's not as simple as I think, but actually it is quite simple to include it in your everyday life. It's a really good point.
Yeah,
I think a really good way, Sarah, to exemplify what you're saying is, for me, if I go food shopping and I put my face mask on, and I find that because I've got the mask on, I'm breathing really shallowly, or, you know, I'm not going in, I'm not breathing into my stomach. It's really short breaths I'm taking. By the time I get home, I'm really quite anxious, not just because of the fact that I'm in the shops, but I'm aware that I haven't been breathing to my full capacity. And as soon as the mask comes off, it's like, you know, you can sort of exhale that anxiety. So great chat, thank you, ladies. Okay, so moving forward then, the next question, we'll have one question in the theme, but it's about difficult conversations around the demands and expectations in schools just now. And Claire, I know this is something you've touched on in your previous webinars, so I wonder if you could start us off there, if that's okay.
Certainly, no, thank you very much. What I'm finding at this particular time in schools, when I'm working with different colleagues in their different settings, is that sometimes we can feel very conflicted about whether we're in recovery, using the recovery curriculum, or whether it's business as usual. And it's very understandable that during lockdown, everyone had a very clear idea as to what to do in terms of, we're all locked down, it's online learning, and there are hubs open, but they're only for the children of the essential workers. And then in preparing to come back for August was about the recovery curriculum. I'm also very aware now, though, that as we shift into October, there might be a shift in some of that messaging, and that is relevant to this idea of demands and expectations. Because are we habituating to what we used to do before, and the level that we used to work at before, and the level of drive that we were putting into this, while still in a place of recovery, and that adds a lot of our kind of stresses, a lot to our stress levels at this particular time. So in terms of what I've been speaking to others about regarding that point, I talk to people about what is core to your work at this particular time. Let's get down to what is absolutely essential. And it's been really heartening to hear so many head teachers recently speaking to me about they've had to strip back the curriculum, they've had to strip back those expectations and demands, and they've had to get very real about what it is that they need at this particular time. So there's something there, and a theme that I'm going to pick up on as I go through this answer, this idea of needs and unmet needs. So stripping it back to the core work. And then I think there's also something about checking in with our own expectations and our own possibilities at this particular time. Now, I know Sarah's going to touch on some of that as we go through this answer, but I'm very aware that there is a need for us to be very clear about our boundaries at this particular time, because what used to mediate the stress before, such as going for a coffee with colleagues after work and going round to someone's house and going out to the pub or whatever, just not there. And I think when we do feel a level of expectation and demand, and what was normally there to mediate that stress isn't gone, then it creates a kind of a real inflection point for us when we are working with one another in our respective settings. So some of the things that I would suggest just now would be to look at, what is high impact and low effort just now? What is high impact and high effort, but keeping it high impact? And then looking at what is low impact and high effort just now, and really get into grappling with what does that really mean and where is it coming from? What are your drivers? Are your drivers about expectations that you habituated to pre-COVID, and because you're back into school and into the way of working with things, those habits are coming back? What is it around about that? Also, I would ask people, and this is complete anathema to most head teachers and line managers, but I would ask people to consider lowering some of their expectations at this time in what they can get done of a day and what they can get done of a week, because with the ever-changing plans that are taking place, people are finding this really difficult to sustain their energy to then keep adapting. That's an added stress. So I had a really useful comment in a session just a couple of weeks ago from a lovely principal teacher who said, I've decided just to come in with a post-it note as my to-do list every day. Anything I can fit on a post-it note, that's what I intend to get done that day. So there's something around there about keeping it realistic, making as much impact as possible, because in making that impact, you get a sense of achievement. And our brains, and Emma and Sarah will go into more detail on this, but our brains need that sense of learning, achievement. That dopamine needs to be coursing right around our brains, give us that sense of moving forward, I suppose, and reward. But I also want to check in with people regarding what is driving your demands. Is it driven by anxiety, or is it driven by the real needs, or is it your perception of what those needs are? And that leads to us creating for ourselves a situation where we have lined up for ourselves a lot of unmet needs. We've done it very unconsciously, but there are perhaps some unmet needs, and then we feel pressure to meet these. So I would always advise people to go and have conversations with people who can support, whether it's the line managers, whether it's colleagues. Now, this takes me on to another tricky conversation to have with you all about key conversations and about the challenging conversations that we sometimes have to have. Because sometimes we can get to a place of thinking, look, I've lowered some of those expectations, I'm doing all that's possible, and yet there is still a lot of things I'm being asked to do. I also direct this towards people who are in leadership positions just now, who are also having to have very challenging conversations with some parents and some people within the community at this particular time. So again, for me, if I think about a challenging conversation that I have to have, which is coming from a place of, say, conflict, often I would, in my kind of practice and in my experience, conflict often boils down to an unmet need. And we need to get really clear about what that unmet need is. It's not about right or wrong. It's just that you are coming to me with an unmet need and I'm coming to you with an unmet need. and we need to have a conversation around some of that. Oftentimes when people come to us with the challenging conversation that they wish to have with us, often if we're not clear about it, the thing that people start talking about is really never the thing. The thing is also a deeper kind of unmet need. So when parents maybe come to us to express their frustration at something, we can often start to unpick what that unmet need is, except when people come to us very emotionally charged, it's very difficult for us to hear the need. And that's why it's really important that we can find ourselves getting into a place of reducing our own stress, and some of the techniques that have been spoken about already. And I would also, say, get to a place of curiosity. Always try and get to that place of curiosity, not from that place of reactivity. And just keep listening to what is the real need and what is my need that I need to convey at this particular time. And I think in these conversations, it's always good to just be really clear, start with a punchline. So if you're going to someone to express what your unmet need is, be clear about it, and be aware that although it can cause emotions, you just want to really grapple with, in as rational a way as possible, what it is to meet that need. And if you're the leader, or indeed the teacher or educator who's being met with that kind of emotional response, I would say, really, if you can, stay curious. The thing is not the thing, and really listen to that unmet need. So these are just some of the thoughts around some of that kind of answer. But I know Sarah will have some great things to add just now.
I think it ties up with what we were just talking around there about breathing as well. When using the breath to help you find that space where you can respond rather than react, which is ultimately where we're all trying to get to in life, never mind in work. But yeah, using the breath as a part of the toolkit to try and find that space so that we are responding and we're choosing to respond rather than to react, because it is so easy to react, especially if someone comes and presents with quite kind of high emotion. That our default is often to react. So it's trying to find that kind of space in there, I suppose. And I think we've touched on it in previous conversations, and Claire perhaps mentioned it as well, but that bit about checking in with what is expectation and what is real, because the majority of educators I meet have exceptionally high standards for themselves and continually worry about falling short, not doing enough, not being enough, not getting through enough, not getting it done fast enough. That whole kind of lack mindset of I've still not done enough, or there's still more to do. And there will always be more to do. There will always be more to do. And so if your goal is to reach that point where there is nothing else to do, then you're in a hamster wheel that's going to cause you a lot of difficulty, and will drive you crazy and just completely wear you out. So I think there's something in there as well around looking at those expectations, but also looking at progress rather than perfection. Perhaps I think we often strive for perfection, even though we know it doesn't exist, but it's really tempting and it's really enticing. But actually trying to look at it from that kind of idea of progress. So what would be a more freeing version of the thing, the goal, the expectation that you've set yourself, and how could you work towards that? Or what would be a less complete version of that, because there is always something, and I think we need to shift that mindset from perfection more towards progress, because it's better to do it and start than to never do it because you fall completely short of it. And just acknowledging and naming those things as well. There are lots of difficult things, there are high pressures, there are demands, there are changing expectations and guidelines all the time at the moment, and some of that we can't control, but we can at least name it, acknowledge it, and kind of by doing that, again, you reduce the charge, the emotional charge that it has over people, or the hold that it has over people. And it sounds very simplistic to say just by naming it that makes a difference, but it actually does. So using that as a kind of tool. And And I really like the work of Viviane Robinson, who talks, she has her book is called Reduce Change to Increase Improvement. And in that she talks about the engage model and the bypass model, and that in the engage model, what we're doing is we're both coming to a situation, we're both able to articulate why we are working or doing the thing that we're doing in the way that we're doing it, where we want to get to, and then together we can find either a solution or a halfway house, or we can adjust the goal, or we can adjust the way that we're doing it, so that actually it's that idea of a win-win situation, I suppose. And key to that process is making the implicit explicit, because how often do we create not just a story, but like multiple chapters and books about the thing that's going on that actually is so far from the reality, but because we made it all implicit, no one kind of went and stopped it, and it's allowed to take hold. So I think even that process of just making the implicit explicit has great potential in there. And lastly, if it is a really difficult conversation, or if it is something you feel like you're really having to kind of steel yourself to do, again, I know it probably sounds obvious, but do it first thing in the morning. Don't make it the thing you do at the end of the day. Get it over and done with, and nail it in the morning when you're feeling fresher, you're a bit more resilient, and you're in a better frame of mind to kind of tackle it. Because the worst thing you can do is keep moving it down your list, because all you do is increase your anxiety and dread about the thing. I know from practice. So that's my
Could I just chip in, Sharon, just on a couple of those points? I thought I really enjoyed listening to those points. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is kind of these setting these unrealistic expectation and these to-do lists, because our brain is future orientated. One of the things I've just been flicking through and trying to find in the book is the to-do list. And I don't know if you've seen this somewhere. Our to-do, it's not a to-do list, it's a to-do list. And the reason is because we sometimes need to make our brain stop, pause and reflect on what we've done well. Our brain is tuned into the negative. It reacts stronger to bad than good. Can't help it, just how we work. It's how our brains work. And it also is future directed. So we need to actually consciously take it back to reflect positively on what we have achieved and what we've done well. And I do this, and I get all my trainees to do it, and they go, "Ooh, that sounds cheesy," and then they do that. Oh, I really like it. So sometimes the best techniques are cheesy, but yeah, it was just to say that as well. I think it's really nice to pause and reflect on what's gone well, because we are generally terrible at doing it for ourselves.
Yeah, there was a really nice kind of going home checklist that was circulated on Twitter for a while. I think it's taken from the NHS, and it was just 4 or 5 things to do before kind of leaving work, and one of those was to check in on yourself, to check in on others, but also, what was one thing that you would do differently in the future, and 3 things that you're grateful for that day. And it's that flick of the switch of like appreciating what's gone well, or looking for the gratitude in our lives, because we're so quick to join all the negative dots and we miss the other ones out. Yeah.
You're right. Brilliant. We have that on every single door in our office. So maybe that is something that we could introduce into teaching as well. Because as I go out every single, I'm like, oh, there's that list again. And just one other thing to what you, Claire, said about unmet needs. I was really interested to listen to that. The other thing I always ask people when they come in with something difficult is, what do you think should happen next? And quite often, I don't need to come up with a solution, because they've got the solution already. They already know what the solution is. When you ask them what they think, what they want to happen next, more often than not, it's very realistic. Sometimes not, but most of all, they do take into account the realistic constraints, and they've given me the answer. So they can tell me their unmet need by telling me what they think needs to happen.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you.
We've had a question from one of our viewers who said any hints or tips to hit that sweet spot between work satisfaction and exhaustion. And I think, ladies, you have just actually answered that question very well. So I'm hoping that our viewer is satisfied with that answer.
Yeah, can I also, I'm going to be put a bit of a downer in this now, I'm so sorry. But the reason I say that is in reading a classic book by Christina Maslach called Burnout, The Cost of Caring. Not the most inspiring of titles, I do apologise, but not my title. But I tell you what, there's a really good chapter in there about people who, so Christina Maslach wrote this book based on the experiences of all those people working in the compassionate industries, so social work, nursing, medicine, teaching, etc. And in chapter 4 of the book, she's interviewed people who have either not suffered any burnout over a number of years, or who have suffered burnout but have bounced back. So there's this whole idea of kind of compassion fatigue. You know, that's what it's known as, isn't it? When you're just giving, and not allowing yourself to receive, not being able to receive for whatever reason. So in this chapter, you've got this whole chapter dedicated to, you know, what supports you within the workplace, but what can also support you at home to replenish your energy levels, to replenish your sense of who you are. And one of the questions that they ask is, who are you when you're not at work? And that's it's a really challenging question, but I think it's a really powerful question to really establish those boundaries, which they also talk about in the book. And there's a lovely little thing that they said, that kind of going home thing, talk about making the transition. How do we, you know, are we conscious about how we make the transitions every day from our workplaces? And I know some of us will be working at home quite a lot just now, but what are we doing to introduce a bit of novelty, just to give us a sense of newness and shifting a bit of that kind of perspective just now? So just something else to add into all these wonderful ideas.
I'm just going to add to that, Claire, and Sharon's probably seen this in the document I did for probationers. I talked about exactly that, shifting from your work brain to your home brain. And as part of that, you need to process that, what's actually going on in your work day. And sometimes we naturally have the ability to process that through a drive or a walk, but we have less ability to do that right now. So it allows yourself to have that shift in time between the work brain and the home brain. And like you say, doing something that helps shift that across.
Yeah. Great. For me, it's just I pack my bag to put it in the corner of the room, but at least it means my laptop's gone away and I know I've left work. So it works for me. So that's great. Thanks very much. Now, the next 3 questions that all deal with are inner critic, imposter syndrome, and the guilt and sense of failing. So I'm going to pass this on to Emma, because I don't know if you know, ladies, we are in the presence of someone who's going to be on live lunchtime TV tomorrow in Steph's Pat Lunch, and to talk all about imposter syndrome. So Emma, over to you.
And there's some massive irony, isn't there, in the fact that I'm feeling like an imposter speaking about imposter syndrome. So anyway, on that, I could talk about this subject all day, so just butt in and interject when you want to come in or stop me. So imposter syndrome, it's not a clinical diagnosis, but it's that kind of feeling that many people have, that we're going to get caught out, that we're not as good as we should be, or that other people think we are. Very, very common. I always think of if Michelle Obama experiences it, which she writes about in her book and which she's spoken about in depth, then goodness me, well, we all experience it, don't we? And I've done lots of interviews over the last 4 weeks, and everybody I've interviewed, I've said, do you experience imposter syndrome? Not one person has said no. So we all experience imposter syndrome. I think understanding that in itself is beneficial. And what is imposter syndrome? At the heart of it is self-doubt. It's self-doubt or feeling a little bit more anxiety, which is totally normal, particularly when we stretch ourselves and we go into a new role, when we're having to deal with something new, when we're having to deal with change. And let's face it, at the moment, who's not dealing with something new and dealing with change? We all are. So it's about that kind of anxiety going out, that doubt in ourselves. And it's working out, first of all, why am I feeling that way? Is there something changed? Have I gone and stepped up to a head teacher role, for example? Have I taken on a new task? Am I doing something outside my comfort zone? And it's really important, because imposter syndrome can get in the way of putting ourselves forward, because it's shown that people are less likely to ask questions in a meeting if they feel it's a stupid question. I'm sure we've all done this, but we'll say, I'm not sure if it's a stupid question. I did it the other day and I thought, I just said what I talk about. I'm not sure if it's a stupid question, but it's like that's kind of caveating that we think it actually probably is a stupid question, but we're going to say that in case it is. So, but people are less likely to ask questions if they feel it, and they're less likely to put themselves forward for promoted roles. They're less likely to take on tasks that they feel they really enjoy, but they might be worried about. Might be more likely to not be able to say no to things in an attempt to prove themselves. So it comes back to the last question we talked about too, about how we can make sure we're looking after ourselves and not taking on too much. So first of all, identifying why you feeling this way, and also it's normal to feel this way to some extent, but are there practical things you can do about it? So for example, can you get a kind of objective stance on how you performed in that meeting, or how you did in the class that day, or how you, whatever you're thinking about, how you did in that talk, on that wellbeing seminar that you did on Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Can you get an objective stance on that? Can you get somebody to kind of look at that, taking out that emotive part of it? Or are there other things? Do you need extra training? Is it actually signaling there is something, a need that you have, an unmet need, like Claire said, I like that, that you can get some additional help about? Or is it just that you're feeling a little bit of self-doubt stepping into a new role, which is perfectly normal? Say if Michelle Obama experiences it, we all do. But also recognize what you're telling yourself, because self-doubt isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's actually really good sometimes. It's a checker. It keeps us working out when we do things wrong or how we can do better. But when it tips into being kind of critically unhelpful, it's not good for us. So keep a check on what you're actually telling yourself when you experience that self-doubt. Are you becoming really kind of self-critical, berating yourself, telling yourself you're an idiot for stumbling over your words in a seminar, for example, or losing track of where you're going, which I'm probably just about to do now. So what are you telling yourself about that? And is that actually, because you're feeling anxious and bad or self-doubt, you're more likely to stumble into kind of criticizing yourself? So step back and think, what am I telling myself? Is that critical voice coming in? And Claire, I'm not going to go down or say too much about developing a compassionate voice, because Claire did a really nice little talk earlier on about kind of stepping back from that, thinking about what you'd say to somebody else and that more objective stance. So try and develop that compassionate voice. But also, really importantly, don't conflate confidence with competence. There is not a direct correlation between confidence and competence. In fact, there's an inverse correlation. Sometimes the most confident people are not that competent, but we have what we call a halo effect, where we think that somebody who's confident is competent. So just because you're not feeling confident doesn't mean you're incompetent. It actually probably shows that you're quite competent because you're able to identify the gaps in your knowledge. And that's what competence is about. Competence is not about knowing everything. Competence is about knowing what you do know and what you need to seek additional information on. So don't conflate, if my takeaway message is, don't conflate competence with confidence, because there is an inverse correlation between those. And if for anybody wants to go and look at the research, it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which shows that inverse correlation. The more competent we are, actually, the less competent we are, the more confident we are doing a task. And the more competent we are doing it, that reduces significantly. So that's my takeaway message. So I'm going to pass over before I lose track and start to feel imposter syndrome about talking about imposter syndrome.
Anyway, who would like to come in? Anybody?
I'm just feeling a lot more satisfied with my with my lack of confidence, knowing how competent I am now. I think that's how I took that. I'm not sure.
So how about, who can help with the answer about dealing with those ongoing feelings of guilt? So there's a question, one of our pre-submitted questions within this theme was about guilt of failing my pupils. There's also the guilt of not doing enough, which we've kind of covered with the last question. But I've also got a new question here about somebody who suffers ill health and therefore can often be off work and then feels very guilty about that, particularly in these current times when demands are so high on everyone. So how do we cope with the guilt?
I'm happy to come in with that. First of all, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I think a lot of this is about kind of where we are, or first of all, the meaning we're taking from it, and also where we're putting the responsibility. So the questions about guilt, about not being able to meet your pupils' needs, that's a hard thing to kind of live with. But when we start to internalize the responsibility for that and blame ourselves for it, or feel that we should be doing something more, then that becomes more difficult. Whereas if we recognise that I'm not able to do that because the situation is like this, or we externalise and we recognise all those factors contributing to it, rather than just feeling that kind of personal responsibility, it doesn't take away the fact it's difficult, because it is difficult. We're not going to be able to make a difficult situation easy because it's difficult, but we can start to think about, okay, where does the guilt exist here? Is it actually my personal responsibility, or is it actually just something that's a result of the situation right now? And kind of looking at am I giving myself responsibility for those aspects I don't have any control over, which we often do, or is there things that I can actually do, or am I actually doing everything I can do already? So just thinking about where you're making that attribution. Are you taking personal responsibility for things which actually are a result of kind of system, and there's multiple factors contributing to it, and not just your own kind of actions contributing to it?
I think there's also something about the guilt. Every emotion is neither good nor bad, and it tells us something. And I suppose when an emotion arrives, if you like, I was keeping to my externalizations all these times there, but if that emotion is there for us and we're feeling that emotion, what is it also telling us at a very positive level? So for example, if I'm feeling guilt about failing my pupils, it shows that I care. It shows that I care about wanting to get it right, and it shows that I'm still motivated to get that right. It's just that sometimes if I overdo the guilt, I can decrease that kind of motivation. And yeah, I suppose it's just that kind of idea of emotions can be very purposeful if we can harness them, and if we can look at what they can prompt us to do. But I think it is about the reframing, which is what I use a lot of the time, that, this emotion is here, what are the questions we can ask about this guilt, and then what are examples of the reframe. So as I say, guilt shows that I care about my pupils, guilt shows that I want to get it right, I want to do my best, and that could be motivating.
I think I like what you said about the meaning there, Claire, because it's what meaning are we giving it, isn't it? So I can't meet my pupils' needs, so I am incompetent, is obviously going to make you bad. But if you reframe that to, I feel guilty because I'm not meeting my pupils' needs because I'm, I really care about them. It's still the same emotion, but the end product becomes very different. We don't make that emotion more complex and difficult. So yeah, I really like that.
I think it's very important to remember that we still have the recovery curriculum just now as well. So to keep reminding ourselves that we're doing that from a place of kindness and love, and that actually it's about meeting the needs of our children, and that's why things are slightly different just now. So to remember that. Yeah. Great, thanks very much for that. Now I'm going to go to the question pane. There is one question I have here I would really like your thoughts on, and this comes from a student teacher, Kirsty. She's saying, as student teachers, especially on placement, how do we manage our expectations on staff and pupils in a school? There is a reluctance to put pressure on already stressed staff working in an unusual environment, whilst also obviously requiring support and assistance to meet the expectations of placement.
I would go, sorry to just jump in there, but I think I would go back to that kind of answer of, what Sarah was saying, what I was saying as well, about being realistic about what is achievable. And I think when you're on placement, I think it's good to engage your mentor, tutor, as soon as you can about some of this, because tutors will not necessarily have an understanding of what is happening in each of the schools. And there is a singular context to each of the schools because of their physicality, because of the arrangements. So I think getting in touch as quickly as possible. What that also does is it enables you to take control. Instead of waiting for the tutor to arrive one day to all that's happening, you are taking back your control. And at a time when we don't really feel great autonomy in everything that's happening to us, and everyone in school feels this just now, from the head teacher to the janitorial staff and and so on and so forth, everyone is feeling the imposition of the procedures from the current pandemic and what's needed. So for me, it's about taking control, opening up the line of communication with the mentor, with the tutor as well, and being able to convey, what the expectations are from the particular school at this time, and therefore how can it be recalibrated with the expectations and the outcomes for the particular placement. And it may be that, for example, you know, there are certain outcomes that just won't be possible to achieve in that particular setting on this placement, and therefore can they be carried forward, can they be taken into a further placement. So I don't know if that's very pragmatic of me, but just
I was just going to add there as well, you know, I think that whole thing we said at the beginning around giving and receiving and how people like to help as well. And actually, I know a lot of people want to have conversations about learning and teaching, about nurture, about children's relationships and emotions and development, and not about COVID and health and safety. So sometimes, again, you know, we might feel like that brings a burden or brings another task to people, but actually, when people have those kind of conversations, that's often when they come alive. And so not to assume that that's going to be a bad thing. Actually, that can really energize people to have the kind of conversations that we want to be a priority first and foremost, again, in our schools and in our lives. But there is still space for them. Just now it might be slightly different, but actually they're really energizing for people as well. So I think there's a possibility and a positivity in that as well.
I love that, Sarah. And there's also something that's been coming through for me about people holding on to what's normal and familiar because it's safe, and that makes us feel safe. So if I can get back to talking about the nurture, the learning, then yes, you know, that's a good place to be. So no, that's great. I love that.
Building positive relationships is so important as well, isn't it? And really getting to know your school support teacher and your ITE mentor, and building those relationships so that you can actually say, this is how I'm feeling, and how can we make it work for my placement. So brilliant answers, thank you. Okay, I'd like to move on to the next section, and the theme. We had 3 questions under this theme, and it was of supporting teams when meeting online and concerns, the feelings of isolation for those of us who are working from home online. I wonder if, Sarah, are you able to start with that one, please?
Yeah. Yeah, do you know, the first thing that comes to mind, and it sounds really obvious, is to ask people. You know, ask people how you can help them, or do they need help? Because again, maybe we're assuming that there's something going on for them because it's going on for us. Maybe we feel isolated and we're assuming everyone else does, or everyone else feels the same way. So I think, you know, ask, don't assume, and ask that question, how can I help? Or how can we help each other? And again, it comes back to that giving and receiving. And you know, I think we're all striving or seeking connection at the moment in lots of different ways. So remembering that helping and supporting is that two-way thing, and actually how can we support each other in this time, in this space, especially when, you know, if you're an outreach team or and you're still working from home, when other parts of the system seem to have gone back to something that resembles normal, I think that can be hard, because that probably questions your identity and your role and how you do what you do, and everyone else is back doing something that looks quite similar to what they were doing before. So there's probably things in there to unpick a little bit, but just by being really intentional with that connection, you know, we hanker after the face-to-face and the, you know, less than 2 meters, and I think we can often then think, oh, online is bad or negative in some way. And, you know, ideally we would be face to face, but we can still connect online, and that connection is still valuable. And I think we have to be careful not to create a narrative about that being less good than it is or less effective than it is, because it can be extremely, extremely effective, and it can work really well. And you know, we saw that when we first went into lockdown, things that we started to do and the way we started to connect with each other. But because restrictions changed and things eased, some of those things have stopped happening. So I think there is something about also revisiting, what did we do that worked in those early days, and do we need to bring some of that back in, because we've probably let it fall away, and really planning and diarying opportunities to connect while also still being spontaneous. So, you know, when I worked in an open plan office, the bit that I missed when I stopped working in that place was those spontaneous connections and conversations and the passing of people and those little bits of connection. But you know, we can still create those. You can text someone or message someone and say, have you got 5 minutes for a chat? And it doesn't need to be, have you got an hour for a meeting about X, but actually, have you got 5 minutes for a chat? And that can be as much as you need to shift how you're feeling, to feel reconnected with people as well. I've tried doing sometimes some walk and talks. So rather than always it being online video kind of calls, but just talking on the phone while being out for a walk and the other person doing the same. And so again, it's just a different way of connecting that allows you to get away from a screen, because we do spend a lot of time on screens now. But yeah, I think, yeah, revisit some of those things that we probably started in the beginning and have let go, because parts of life have begun to come back to some form of normality.
I would really echo that idea of we've got to make the time, because things are not business as usual. We're not back to normal. And even chatting to some groups quite recently, as you say, Sarah, and rightly so, we've lost all that good investment in one another that we made during lockdown, because we had to, because there was no other way. And although some of that has shifted, it's still not quite as we would like it. So this particular group I was working with were saying, well, we just don't meet up, and we need to meet up, we need to find a way to meet, but there's not the time. And then we stumbled across this idea of, there's going to be an established weekly drop-in time. It's there, it's a drop-in online session. And if you can make it, great, but it's there. And as you say, it's about being creative about those possibilities. And I remember when we were having a conversation recently, Sarah, you said, picking up the phone, and I went, oh yeah, people used to phone each other, I remember. So it's just sometimes the most obvious things that can hit us between the eyes, which are really powerful.
Yeah, leaving voice notes as well rather than text messages. Yeah. I've started doing that with people as well, because it's a quick, easy form of communication, but actually to receive one, I know when you hear someone else's voice, even though it's just the equivalent of a text message, it's quite nice. You feel a different kind of connection to that person. And the other thing that I've done sometimes is like a silent online co-working. So just arranging for an hour together to co-work as you would in a kind of open plan office. So you're online, but you're on silent just for an hour. But it sounds bizarre, but I've done it a number of times as a being part of it, and it changes your energy quite significantly. And it can really be really good to, sometimes that's a space where you kind of tackle the things you've been putting off, just because there's that little bit of accountability. You've said what you'll do, what you're planning to do in that time, and just that shift in energy is really, it sounds odd, but trust me, it works.
It sounds great, actually. I'm actually reminded, and it's off at a bit of a tangent, but I remember as a head teacher, and a very good head teacher colleague of mine introduced silent assemblies, which is kind of similar, where all the children are sat together, but it's silent. And what she talked about was the need for children to just have space together, but in that kind of silence, and it's that presence again. So I think there's something there, about being present and what that means at this particular time. And I think tapping into that idea of what it is to be present, I think there's this, even though it's online, we still have that need to emotionally regulate with one another. And when we are kind of out of contact, for a while, we do start to feel that kicking in. So when we are having those online meetings, I think it's important for us to be intentional again as to the purpose. So what I'm listening to when I'm working with different schools and different settings is that there can at the moment just be the meetings which are simply operational. Or if there are meetings to talk about how we're feeling, sometimes people can say it's quite negatively skewed in terms of an offload. And there needs to be the time to just meet up and have some fun, even if it's online. So just as you said before, way back in lockdown, people were organising quizzes and were organising all sorts of stuff. And in working with a school recently, I love this idea. I don't know how it's worked, and I didn't like to ask too many deep questions about how it was being done. But this school came up with this idea of, because we're all working in staff bubbles, what we're going to do is we're going to have bubble karaoke right across the school. Now, that's an insane idea, but it's just fun, and it's a way to interact. It's just a bit of a laugh at the end of the day. So just anything that's possible at that time is important. But I suppose I go back to that idea that we were talking about earlier, Sarah. This idea of, we can often feel responsible for other people's feelings, but it's actually not our job. You can't take on other people's feelings, because they have to feel what they feel. It's theirs. It's their gift, if you like, to process and to do what they can with it. So our role may be to create the opportunities to share spaces and to share with one another, so that we can create our own individual coherence, because you were saying there about narratives, so how do we build our own individual coherence through contact with each other, and how do we build a collective coherence? Because I'm very struck by this whole idea that stories connect us. Stories they have that power. If you think about, I believe there's a very special election taking place next week over the big pond. There have been a lot of taglines and campaign lines, and they're actually stories just summed up in a few words. Make America Great Again, for example, is telling us a whole story in 4 words. That America wasn't great, but now, if you vote for this guy, then it will be great again. So what are the stories and the kind of motifs that we are recurrently telling ourselves about, as you say, the limitations of the online contact, or what are the stories we're telling about how creative we can be? And just one last thing, there's a really interesting paper that was written by a number of behavioural psychologists recently on the back of the impact of COVID on communities and on societies in different parts of the world. And there's a Professor Stephen Reicher from the University of St Andrews, and with some other colleagues from universities around the world, they've written this paper called Together Apart. So this idea about, in a time of physical distance, we need to stay socially connected. So how do we do that? And you can download that for free. I only talk about free things here now, but you can download that for free, and I don't get any commission. There you are. So it's paper and interesting work.
I'd like to pick up on just one of the questions within that theme that it sounds like it's come from a school leader who's saying, how can that person lead and support the team and their health and well-being whilst managing the pressures that they have from their line managers and Scottish Government? So any quick tips for leaders to do that?
Well, I think leaders have a role in creating the opportunities to connect. I think leaders have an opportunity about the ways in which they can direct, or not direct, but just think about ways of connecting. In terms of, I suppose, leaders always have a duty of care. There's always the duty of care, and in these exceptionally difficult times, leaders reaching out, I think, is very important and goes a long way. Even though leaders might think, I don't want to be prying, or I don't want to interfere, but it's making a huge difference when leaders are reaching out at this time of crisis. And I do wonder if our workload has changed in its nature at this particular time. And in speaking to a wonderful group of head teachers just this morning, one of the head teachers said, these are my priorities. I go where the greatest need is that in that particular day. So I think there's something again around our expectations about the time that we're in, about a reality check regarding what is possible of a day, but perhaps making more of our core work at the moment inclusive of those relationships, I think is absolutely imperative at this time, not only because there is that need, but for the future as well. Just what I think Emma and Sarah had said earlier about those trusting relationships. It's like Stephen Covey talks about making deposits in the emotional bank account. That in fact, every interaction that we have, you deposit trust, or you deposit an emotional, something that's of emotional worth. And therefore, managers, I think, have an opportunity at this particular time to relate differently to the people they have responsibility for. And I think it's a professional judgment call regarding what they wish to invest in at this particular time. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone else wants to come in with anything on top.
I'll chip in, Claire, because I think, you know, the whole responsibility doesn't come down to the leader. I see the leader's responsibility as identifying that need, hearing people's stories in the first place, and then facilitating the solutions.
Yes.
And the solutions need to be team-based, though. You need to all be facilitating the solutions. The solutions can't just come from the leader, because they can't know everybody's story. Everybody's story needs to be taken into that solution. So the leader's responsibility is to allow that story to be heard and then facilitate the solutions to that story. I'm just going to come back to a different point that kind of taps into both what you and Sarah said about what the solutions are. There is no one size fits all approach, unfortunately. I wish there was, but everybody's needs are different. And so for some people, might be having those meetings that Sarah described, the kind of silent workplace. That to me raises my anxiety so much that I would just be constantly self-monitoring. So that wouldn't be beneficial to me, because I'd be scared I'd forget and start eating my lunch and dribbling down my chin or something. So that would not be a solution for me. But that's okay. So it's about gathering where the solutions are, and people have the solutions in mind. You don't need to come up with novel ideas. People know the solutions. They know what they need once they're asked, and once they're provided with that opportunity to tell you. So it's like a gathering. What I can tell you, I would hate those meetings, but I could tell you what would be beneficial to me. So it's about gathering that together and facilitating the team together, putting in goals to meet those needs and facilitating the support strategies in place.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for these answers. Okay, so our next question I'm going to hand over to Sarah. So it's about regarding working from home with aches and pains, which we all feel. And Sarah, as a yoga teacher, has prepped the response to us. So let's hear it, Sarah.
I would like to point out I am not giving medical advice. And that you can get a workstation assessment from your employer, and also usually there's physio available in through local authorities as well. So if you don't forget, those things are options. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about some things that might help and might be options. And I know that the question that came through, the person said that they do take regular breaks, and I would just encourage you to think about how regular, because we can think we've taken regular breaks, but actually we can end up sitting and not moving for quite significant periods of time without really realizing. So I would recommend definitely not necessarily setting an alarm, because that might stress you as well, but trying to get up and move at least sort of every 20 minutes. And just make sure that you move around. What I've done for today is create a standing desk, because again, we're not really designed to sit and not move for hours on end. And if you're still working from home, you're probably working from home because you're used to being in and out of different schools and in and out of the car and in and out of different spaces, and so actually sitting is so alien to the way you would normally operate that probably isn't helping either. So creating a standing desk can make a difference. You probably can't use it all the time, but you can certainly use it for parts of what you're doing, I'm sure. Mine is not at all fancy, so all I've done is take a side table from the living room and put it on top of my desk, and then put my laptop on that table. So I've not invested heavily in buying some kind of snazzy wind up electronic standing desk, which I know you can get, but actually you can do it really simply with just a few tables, and I've got a few cookery books as well, stacking things up. So I would recommend it, because it can make quite a difference just even to your energy and how you're feeling, because again, we're not used to sitting all of the time. But just for a bit of light entertainment, I'm setting that up like I'm something crazy. I'm really not. But the person also mentioned having quite a sore back or aches and pains in the kind of upper back, and this is a Dharma wheel. I feel like I should be on what's the shopping channel or something. I don't think I'd
QVC.
QVC, yeah. A Dharma wheel is a kind of love-hate thing for me. it's great for really releasing tight muscles in your upper back and your shoulders, but it's also really uncomfortable because that does tend to be quite tight for me. So it's one of those things that you kind of grit your teeth and grin and bear it, but they're really good. So you place it in the middle of your upper back when you're lying down. So it just really forces you to open up either the upper part of your back or the lower part of your back. So it's a fun stroke grim experience sometimes. The other thing I have, this is one of my favorite things. So this is a yoga bolster. So you get them online, various different places. This is my favorite thing. So lying down on the floor, placing this under your knees just is the most relaxing, supported place to kind of rest. So sometimes what I will do is, if I've been sitting for so long, is just do a couple of minutes lying on the floor, this under my knees. Honestly, it's like heaven. But the other thing you can do is turn it this way. So you would be lying, your back is on here, and what that does is it allows your shoulders to drop down, and you kind of get that nice opening through the front of your chest and your shoulders as well, which is lovely. And my last kind of my favorite yoga posture to do, just to get a real deep sense of kind of rest and relaxation, is to lie on the floor. Well, actually, do you ever remember as a child lying on the sofa with your feet up the back of the sofa, your legs up the back of the sofa? I love doing that. And then I discovered it's a yoga posture, and it brings a kind of a really lovely sense of deep relaxation as well. So doing it lying on the floor, technical term, scooch your bottom right up to the wall, to the skirting board, and then just swish your legs up the wall. So your legs are against the wall, your bum's as close to the wall as you can possibly get it, and just chill out and relax. Just let yourself be in that space, which is just a really nice, relaxing thing to do, especially if you've got tired legs or you've been sitting for quite a while. And again, just allows the back to kind of relax and release. But there's loads of apps and things like that you can look at for chair yoga or desk yoga, lots of different things. But they would be my tips, my favorite things to do.
That's my night sorted. That's great.
Yeah,
Sarah.
we'll be online now, won't we? Shopping. Deliveries for tomorrow. Great. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so we have got us 5:22. The next question I'm going to ask Emma to answer, and then we'll need to probably be as quick as we can so we can go to one question I have for you on the question pane. So the question was about the theme was about being hypervigilant and coping with exhaustion, particularly in an ASN setting, but it would be really good to know how to cope with that just now, in particularly with COVID and all the rules and regulations that teachers are having to adhere to.
I shall try to be quick and now aware of all my aches and pains after Sarah speaking. I'm wriggling about here. I think the answer to this is twofold. It's what you can do as an individual, but also what you can do as a system to support exhaustion and hypervigilance. Because what happens when we're hypervigilant, we've basically got our foot on our body's gas pedal. We've got that sympathetic nervous system in kind of action the entire time, and what that does is it uses our energy, uses our body's resources, and depletes us. And that was a perfect example of when you have to be hypervigilant. That's probably quite helpful in that setting, because you need to be aware of what's going on constantly, and you need to be aware of threat. However, we're also hypervigilant at the moment because of COVID, but I also assess people's cognition, and I would say teaching as a profession is one of the highest cognitive demanding professions there is, because you need to be constantly switched on, your work memory is constantly used. So it's generally quite an exhausting profession anyway. So how do we manage that? First of all, planning in restful activities when we know we're in a period of hypervigilance on an individual level, allowing ourselves to not just breaks but do things that are restful, engage our parasympathetic nervous system, that allow us to really relax, downloading or decreasing our expectations after we know we're going to be in high vigilance the entire time as an individual. Again, thinking about what takes us off that parasympathetic, the sympathetic roundabout, and what engages that rest and digest system. but it also needs, it's not just about individuals managing this, it also needs to be managed as a system. If we know our staff are in high vigilance situations, can we then manage that so we put them in a lower vigilance situation afterwards? Can we manage the vigilance or allow them time to decompress and take that vigilance down, so allow additional breaks? What can we do as a system to support that? Because it's not just about the individual. And can we have support mechanisms in place regularly so that we can talk through any concerns we have? Because when we're in hypervigilant mode, it's very hard to know if exactly what we did was right all the time, because we haven't got working memory to reflect on it. So you need a reflection space at some point, as regularly as possible, to reflect about what's happened, any challenges we had when we're in that hypervigilance zone. And also, just because when we come out of that, we're in threat mode, we are more likely to think we've done something wrong. If we feel confident in what we've done in that time, we're going to go away from that hypervigilance mode, more likely to be able to relax. So it's not just the individual that needs to manage that, it needs to be a systems approach to managing that as well.
Great answer, thank you, Emma. Okay, so that's us reached the end of all our submitted questions and themes, and I just wanted to quickly ask the last question here, which is coming from Christine. So she's asking, how do we change our mindset? Teachers often feel that presenteeism in the physical building is an expectation, even when it's safer and more effective way to do this by working at home straight after school. So how do we change that mindset? Any takers?
I think that requires a massive cultural shift, and I would say working in the NHS, we have a very similar mindset as well. I think COVID is forcing us to change that mindset a little bit, and trusting our staff, knowing that they are doing what they need them to do. Trust is really key, trusting that people are getting the job done, and if people feel they're trusted, they are more likely to deliver and work as well. So I think it's trust and making it explicit what our values are in our organisation and how we will deliver those. So I've talked in a very broad way about that, and I'm going to pass over to Claire because I'm aware she's coming in as well.
Well, I was just thinking about this idea of what is my worth attached to, and how do I show my dedication. So it's very similar to what you're touching on there, or what you've been explaining there rather, Emma, because I'm very aware that in certain, as you say, it's a cultural shift, and I'm very aware from my experience over the years, it could be a badge of honour if you were leaving late of an evening. So there is something about what have we allowed as a culture, what have we enabled that is no longer serving us, and in fact depleting us, depleting our energy levels, depleting our sense of what matters as well. So I would just look inwards to say, look, how do I show my true worth through the work that I do? A really good book, again an old one, but The Courage to Teach by Parker Palmer. He talks about this idea of your identity and your integrity. He talks about this idea of, you know, who I am as an educator is expressed through what I do, and that's my integrity. And therefore we shouldn't feel any guilt or any bad feelings about you know, going home when we go home, because, as you say, it goes back to the idea of trusting ourselves and enabling that trust through a culture that my line managers and other people who are monitoring, whatever this word means, are giving me my place, and trust me in the work that I do.
I suppose leading by example will come into there as well.
Absolutely. And how do we define success as well? Success is not getting all the things done because it's impossible. Success is not staying until 10 o'clock at school. Success is looking after your staff so they can look after the people they need to look after.
Yeah, I often tell that story of, you know, if you're in school, you know, you will never at any point go to your head teacher and say, all my class can read now, so we're taking next term off. You know, it's just there's no finishing line. It's just continual learning. So it's about us putting in realistic boundaries, aspirational at times, absolutely, but being realistic too about that.
Thanks very much, Lady.
I was going to say, also thinking about who you surround yourself with as well, and you know, are the people around you, are their values and their ideals and their successes aligned to yours, and thinking about, you know, what are you comparing with, and are you comparing with people who you're not aligned to, in which case just let that go, and the people who you are aligned with and the people whose values reflect yours, kind of use them more as a comparison if you want a comparison, or if you want that support, that connection as well.
Great suggestions. That's us come to the end of our webinar this evening. I can't believe that's been an hour and a half. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. Can I just say a big thanks to our listeners for signing up today and spending this evening with us. It's been lovely having you with us, and we hope we've answered your questions that you had. And finally, can I thank you, lovely ladies, for taking part and making this an absolute pleasure today. I've really enjoyed working with you, so thank you so very much. Fraser, can I hand over to you?
Thank you.
Emily. Thank you to our panel, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. A recording of the webinar will be available on our Health and Wellbeing Hub in the next 48 hours. On our hub, you'll also find a variety of resources and advice to support teacher and lecturer health and wellbeing. Just Google GTCS Health and Wellbeing to find the hub. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. On behalf of GTC Scotland and our panel, thank you for joining us today and enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.